Okie doke. Hi, welcome. I figured I would Verb posted in the Mancers Union Discord earlier, and I was actually a little bit inspired by what Verb was asking. So I think I'm gonna hold on. Let me switch up real quick. There we go. I think I'll just open up with this topic because it's a really good question. Verb asks, I'm thinking of coming back to drawing with a focus on backgrounds, but I have no idea how to start. Any suggestions? I've never drawn a background in my life except for maybe some sun, clouds, and stick circle trees as a kid. So, there's a lot of places that you can start with that, right? I would actually say, like, learning how to draw backgrounds is much easier than learning how to draw, like, anatomy. And the reason I say that is so if you want to like do for if you want to learn how to draw anything, first of all, let's just open up with this. Whatever it is, whether it's cars, people, trees, cats, dogs, you name it, the best way to start is to start drawing from real life. So, the reason why I say it might be more difficult to learn how to draw people, drawing anatomy, particularly people, is because if you want to learn how to draw them, you need to draw them. Like you need to stare at them and draw them, which is a very it's a more difficult thing to do nowadays than it was when I was a young lad because at that time people were not as self-conscious or like fixated on, being viewed at by every single little thing in the world. Nowadays, everything has a camera. Everybody's super self-conscious about like being spied upon and whatever. So even if it's like an artist sitting in the corner of a cafe, some people get weirded out about it. And also, it depends on the age of the person. I don't know, like knowing Verb's much younger. Um, Verb could probably get away with, sitting in the back of a cafe and just like drawing people. But that's the first way to do it, right? So like the reason why I say that's easier for if you want to draw backgrounds, well, you can just walk out of your house, go find a nice view, right? Maybe bring a viewfinder with you. And literally all a viewfinder is you just, you take a couple pieces of cardboard and you just make like something that allows you to contain within an image what you want to look at so you can think about composing um, composing your picture basically. And really more than anything I would say if you're learning how to draw backgrounds, composition is where that becomes sort of magnified in its importance because in a lot of ways background artists are also working hand in hand with like people who are composing the shots for things. So like let's say you're talking about designing a background for I don't know like a video game or something. Well, you're composing the stage. If you're the background artist, you're composing the stage on which, to one extent or another, anyway, on which the character is going to like create on and be, walking around on or jumping around on or whatever. And there's different levels of that, right? Because there are the concept artists, which are the people who they just come up with how the thing looks, right? And you have the background artist, which does more of a, deliberate sort of this. Our better word is probably, and I think the more professional word is environmental artist. So that's in regards to video games, right? If you're talking about animation, that's a little different. So, if you're talking about in regards to animation, you're very explicitly doing a lot of work with how the shot is being composed. And so you're going to be working with the storyboard artists, you're going to be working with the animators in order to like get a properly composed shot, because backgrounds are going to be probably the most crucial part of that, right? Because the background is the stage on which the character acting is taking place, and oftentimes also where the characters are interacting with stuff, you know. So all that has to be staged out and thought of in a very deliberate way. But going back to sort of just like fundamentals, right? The bricklaying portion of, you know, learning how to create backgrounds, do landscape painting. Just, just that's a great place to start, and it's an easy place to start too. Anybody can do it. Anybody can just step out of their house, grab some watercolor paints or some acrylics. If you're feeling really chancy, grabbing oils, which I actually don't recommend because oils are toxic, which is not something that people talk about too often. Oils are super toxic, like bad for you to breathe in. Like you can only use them outdoors or in a well ventilated space. Um, you know, like one of my favorite art educators ever, and probably the goat as far as art educators go, Bob Ross. Like he died at a relatively young age because you know uh, oils, like oil painting. You know, there's a lot of beautiful work you can make out of oil painting, but it's actually like totally horrible for artists. It is killed or ruined a lot of the health of a lot of artists. Frank Frazetta is another like example. He was all in on oil paints, and like he was kind of a spendthrift sort of guy, and he would just like not necessarily do the best do the best job of like taking care of himself and taking care of like his studio and keeping it sort of like well ventilated and stuff. And he like in his later years of life, he really had like a really some really bad situations that came about for his overall health because he was using oils. So anyway, word of caution: if you're gonna do painting, avoid oils. But there's pencil colors, there's markers. Out of your options available, markers are expensive. Pencil colors, not so much. Watercolors are not too expensive. Acrylics are a little more expensive than watercolors. And with watercolors, it kind of depends on, you know, um, some are better than others. I prefer the tube watercolors. Some people swear by like the palettes, like the cakes. Um, it just depends on where you're at and like what it is that you feel most comfortable with. So I would say if I were you and you're just a young buck learning how to um, learning how to paint and draw things, I would say get adventurous and like either you find a setup for yourself that works really well, like you find a good pad of like some paper to work on, right? And then you find an afternoon for yourself, maybe once a week, maybe a couple times a week. You walk out of the house and you go find just a very pretty area. And this is just from starting. This is just starting out. Just find a very pretty area that looks nice to you. And you can either, take a picture of it and bring it back with you to your house and work at your house, or you can paint there in the field. There are advantages to painting in the field and working in the field. One of the main advantages to working in the field is that you are more likely to get the essence of what it is that you're painting, and there is a very subtle thing that happens with the human mind when it is drawing or painting something that is right in front of them. You tend to pick up stuff that you're not quite able to pick up when it's just a picture. And part of that is because when you're working from a picture, and I say, by the way, when I do warm ups every day that are like life drawing warm-ups. I'll draw like anatomical, or I'll draw like photos of people, and just as a way to like work on my anatomy, just warm myself up and get to a place where like, okay, I feel good, I'm ready to draw, you know. But I use pictures, right? There's like an online resource that's you can just you can just Google in life drawing online, and you'll find a bunch of different resources. Um, that work with your needs, right? If you're not comfortable with drawing nudes, you can have clothed figures. If you're totally comfortable with drawing nudes, also not a problem. Blah blah blah. Anyway, point is, there is something about when you're working from a photograph, the photograph always flattens and abstracts the figure, even if it is technically a photo of a figure. And so what your human eye will draw and replicate, it's not the three-dimensional figure. It replicates the two-dimensional drawing. And that's not that that's a necessarily bad thing. Like, you're still going to learn, right? You're still going to learn human anatomy, but you're going to have a harder time learning, and bear with me, I'm trying to use this as a correlate, for drawing, like, environments. You're not going to be able to understand properly the 3D anatomical form of the human being because, from different angles, right, the human figure changes a lot. And the point of life drawing and its like actual fullest meaning is to be able to learn how to understand the human figure from every possible angle, which I haven't yet. Like, there are angles that are very difficult for me to draw still. Top down is a hard one because you hardly ever see somebody from that perspective unless you're like looking at them from the top of the stairs, or and it's not used that often, right? The and I'm sorry, this is a big tangent, but I think it's an important tangent. And also, in general, we see people head on in from 3/4 views or from the back, right? We don't usually see them from below or from above. So it's harder to do because they're just not perspectives by which we see people very often. So, getting back to sort of the original point, in regards to backgrounds and in regards to sort of this, Verb sort of put this under the idea of like drawing backgrounds, and I think, to expand on that idea, drawing or depicting environments, right? So, really honestly, like a great passive way to learn, because this is how I passively learned how to paint better, was I just watched Bob Ross videos, which you can find all over the internet. It's the easiest thing to find in the world. People stream Bob Ross videos all the time, and largely not because you're going to be able to necessarily paint trees better, but if you do watch any Bob Ross videos, what I would recommend is that you actually pay attention to what is the actual process that he's using. And that process is dependent on the medium, right? So like he's using oil paint, so that is favorable towards his process, which is working background to foreground. So like very distant background, he usually starts with the sky, and then he does a mountain, and then distant trees, and then closer trees, and then there's like a pond, and then there's like some trees in the foreground or rocks. And that's like the what you call the pattern, by which he makes all of his environments. Well, this is super useful, actually. Like, this is a very super useful sort of way to approach and learn how to do paintings in a way that is like, what's the word? Like, replicable. That's the word I'm going for. I wish I had a better word right now, but it's in such a way that what you're setting yourself up for, and you know what you're working towards, and so you don't have as many surprises, and so that allows you to actually, in a way, prepare for the surprises better when you go to work and to paint or draw or whatever it is that you're doing. Um, so like so why I say that this is just a way of doing it is because like sometimes, and I haven't done this in a while, and I'm sure I'll do it again in the future, but like there are a couple of streams I've done where I've shown sort of my process on painting when I'm using ink as part of the medium, like ink and watercolor. Well, when I'm doing that, I start with the foreground usually because the ink is so dark that the watercolor can't do anything to it. It can't impact it. So I'll start with the foreground and then kind of work my way into the background. Um, and that's just for that particular medium. If I were doing oils, I would probably be doing sort of the Bob Ross method, which is, it's not necessarily his method. It's like a pretty standard painting method. It's been kind of an idea for a very long time of how to like if you're an art because for a long time and we're talking about painting going back to eons, maybe not eons, but like let's say about at least as far back as about Renaissance period, so let's say about 1400s 1500s, you had artists who would go into the and this is a whole other topic I might brush into a little bit more, but they would go into the field to do studies for their paintings, and so when they did that, they were taking like their oils with them, and they had like God only knows what kind of canvas, probably like sheepskin or something. I don't know. But a lot of times these artists were putting together the canvases on their own. They were putting their paints together on their own. So like everything was very deliberately thought out from the ground up. And so when they were going out into the field to like find backgrounds to do, they were seeking out something that was going to fit in the composition of whatever it was that they were painting. So I don't know, let's say for example, most infamous Renaissance painting, the Mona Lisa, right? The background on the Mona Lisa, by the way, is not that amazing. Leonardo da Vinci, and like a lot of Renaissance artists, when it was like nature landscape type stuff, they tended to be a little bit. They kind of phoned it in a little bit. Now, if it were buildings, totally different, because at that time, being able to like accurately depict buildings was like it was like the new technique. It was like NFTs or blockchain of the time. It was just like one of those things where nobody could wrap their head around. How did you figure this out? How are you doing this? Blah blah blah. Anyway, my point in all this is if you want to learn how to if you want to just like bare bones want to learn how to draw something, go out and draw it. That's the way. But another thing that you can do, and this reminded me of a thing that's pretty important to talk about. If you're doing stuff that is involving drawing buildings, like if you want to learn how to draw cityscapes, houses, neighborhoods, things like that, learn about perspective. You don't have to be an expert at perspective. There are artists whose entire like shtick, is based on like their ability to understand perspective from a full context. And there's tons of resources on the internet, tons of resources on YouTube and online that will teach you about, drawing perspective. So that's about learning how to use a horizon line, how to understand sort of like what are your different angles of perspective, right? So generally, hold on, I'll pull up so when I'm talking about perspective, like let's say we want to draw a building, right? And, oh my God. All right, hold on. We're going to draw a couple buildings, right? And we want to try to naturally depict, we want to be pretty naturalistic in how they're being depicted. We don't want the we don't want the perspective to be all crazy and like, not lining up and just looks, too cartoony. But I like that, but that's not the point here. Well, you start off with a horizon line. Let's see if I can draw a straight line. I can't really. Today, my drawing is a little bit wacky. Anyway, you have a horizon line. And depending on what your perspective is, like, let's say you're just looking down an alley, right? Well, you're only going to have, like, one vanishing point, you know. And technically, I'm doing this incorrect, but who cares? A vanishing point is usually just, you can just depict that with a little dot, right? And then you just start drawing lines from that dot. And you can just start filling it out, you just make sure that your lines always extend from that dot. And then voila. And they're not all going to be perfect, whatever. It's not a big deal. You can start sort of depicting what looks like buildings. Like I said, this isn't perfect. There are much, much, much better instructors on this concept than me. So that's just what is called single point perspective, right? Now let's say that you want to draw, like a corner of a building, right? Well, now you need 2 points of perspective, all right? So I don't really remember all this that well, but just bear with me. It would go there, go there. It would be something like that. I'm doing it totally wrong, but it would be something like that. Anyway, perspective on this level has never been like one of my strong points. And technically, like, those vanishing points would be off the composition too. Like, they would be way out, but I'm just trying to like set up an example for you. So I don't know. We can try it again. No, it's still too steep. That's the problem. It's just like, okay, like something like that, and then, that's still too steep. So anyway, I'm not the best person to ask about doing, because after 2 point you get 3 point, which is incorporating sort of like dimensions of height, right? Like a bird's eye view or worm's eye view. The number of vanishing points goes up to like 7 or 10. It goes a bajillion up. If you're just like that kind of obsessive person. I'm not. That's why I'm not that great. That perspective is that's not something I get obsessive about. I'm more obsessive about wanting to depict like organic form, which is why a lot of my comics tend to have sort of minimal backgrounds, but I do like to have backgrounds. I do like to have environments because that's important to world building. It's important to, depicting sort of what is going on in the world that these characters inhabit. I think having some understanding of how to draw environments is pretty crucial to storytelling. And it's actually a skill set that I feel often, not always, but often gets sort of sidelined for, over focusing on either stylized or like more realistic character art or whatever. Like I see an over focus on getting facial expressions and getting like the drama put out there or expressed, but there's no sense of like, where do these people live? Like, what is happening, in terms of this world that they inhabit on a more total and holistic viewpoint. And whatever, like different artists have different points of strength. But going back to the original topic, I don't need to like I was about to veer into old man yelling at clouds here. Anyway, perspective is important to learn. Even if you're not going to like be a master at it, right? Like I'm not a master at perspective at all. Like at all at all. But I understand it well enough and practiced it enough that I have a general concept about how it works and how things should work. And actually like has given me the ability to understand when I see an artist not using it at all correctly. And for myself when I'm not using it at all correctly as well. And when you're learning that kind of stuff, it can be easy to sort of get too caught up into the formula. And I'm talking specifically with perspective right now. Um, it can you can get caught up in the formula aspect of it, and so a lot of times you might find yourself drawing buildings and they start to look very stiff because in your mind you're like, well, this is how it's supposed to work, this is how it you know this is what I learned. And while it's good to have that knowledge, you have to, at some point when you're learning anything, at some point you have to sort of break down some of the barriers that knowledge might set up for you, where you become over reliant on it. And maybe I'm talking a little bit too advanced and too far out. So like, but anyway, if you're going to learn about perspective for the purposes of drawing not only buildings but vehicles, and this knowledge does also apply to how you draw people, how you draw animals inhabiting an environment. Everything that is impacted by perspective is, everything is impacted by a perspective technically. Now, you won't see that, like, you generally won't see that in animation necessarily. Like, you'll probably see an environment in the background that is, like generally perspectively, I don't think that's a real word, but from the point of view of academically defined, like this is how you use perspective in a environment. It looks good, and then like and I'm complaining about anime again, and then you'll see the characters on the front. They don't fit into the environment technically on any like perspective basis, but they don't need to. It doesn't matter. It's not that important in that scenario. That becomes more important if you're if you're wanting to do like a more realistic illustration. So a great concept artist actually to recommend, and one of my favorite science fiction artists is this guy named Sid Mead. So SYD Sid Mead, MEAD. Go check him out. He has done he did a bunch of illustrations for like book covers for science fiction books. He's done a lot of like concept work for science fiction movies. I'm pretty sure he did a bunch of work for Blade Runner. He's done a bunch of stuff, a bunch of stuff. But amazing painter. From an academic perspective, just like a master of perspective, a master of understanding how vanishing points work. He just has a very interesting style and a very interesting sort of way of depicting his visions of the future, basically. And they're an interesting mix because they're a little bit minimalistic and abstract, but they're also very evocative, I guess. I don't know what the right word to use for that, but he's a really great artist. If you're looking for, like I said, if you're wanting to do more like landscape stuff, like I said, Bob Ross is a good starting point. He's not necessarily like the end-all be-all of like landscape painters. A lot of the landscape painters that I can think of, I can't remember any of their names right now. I think his name is Caspar Friedrich. I could be getting that wrong. Don't quote me on it, but if he's the person I'm thinking of, and maybe I can look it up real quick. Give me a second. Casper, Caspar Friedrich. Yes. Caspar David Friedrich is a painter. I believe he's 18th century. Did some really stunning like landscape paintings. There's another one who I cannot think of right now. Well, I know his last name. I don't know his first name. And he doesn't necessarily do that much in terms of backgrounds, but he's still like an amazing painter. His last name is Bouguereau, which is a fun last name to say. It's spelled Bougereau, I believe. I want to say his full name is William David Bouguereau, but I can't remember. He's a hyperrealist painter. Once again, late 18th century, right before or during the invention of the camera. Very historically interesting too, because there was this movement that was happening of like hyperrealism in painting, either as a reaction to or just as a very curious synchronicity leading up to the invention of the photo camera. And I find it very interesting that sort of like like really I would say the peak height of painting happened at that exact time, because you had painters who were doing stuff that up to that point, in terms of the level of detail and the way in which they were so accurately able to portray light through oil on canvas, honestly, like I don't even know if it's been able to be replicated in quite the same way even today. Although there are tons of talented hyperrealist painters today too. So I'm hoping I can come up with a couple other reference points, but I think those are pretty good starting points in terms of artists you could look at for inspiration. Now, knowing Verb and sort of knowing what his interests are, you would probably you're probably not as necessarily interested, at least in the same scope of what kind of environments you want to depict, right? You're probably more interested in like animation backgrounds, or like sort of the backgrounds you might see in video games, which means it's a little more stylized, a little more abstracted. And I wish I had names of artists to recommend you, but I do not at the moment. So I would just say, think of your favorite games, your favorite anime or animation, and here's a great starting point. You could just look for, just Google search like environmental or background artist Ghibli film or Miyazaki film. You will find some of the best paintings that have ever been in animation, like easily, like without argument. Some of the best paintings, some of the best environmental paintings that have ever been in animation are in Ghibli movies. And I think part of the strength of Ghibli films are largely hinged upon just how good their environmental artists are. I mean, they have good artists all around, right? But their environmental artists are incomparable to any other environmental artist you're going to see in 2D animation. There are still good ones, right? Like, if you look for environmental artists for Don Bluth films, also, incredible. There's some incredible environmental work in Don Bluth films. Land Before Time has some really great background work. I want to say, Secret of Nim. If you ever get a chance to watch Secret of Nim, there's some really good backgrounds in that movie too. Just that Secret of Nim is such a creepy movie. I love that movie, but it has scarred me from childhood. But yeah, amazing background work. Um, I would say, I mean, I don't know, like maybe one day we can do a tier, like a tier mapping of this, because like if we did do tiers, Ghibli films would be S tier, and then like Don Bluth films would probably be A tier. Maybe some of them S tier, but um, Ghibli is S tier, like easily, no argument. Trying to think if I have any other recommendations to make. I think that's it for right now. That's all I can think of in regards to sort of like what's my perspective for somebody who wants to draw environments, wants to get better at drawing them. And like I said, the first place to start is to just, if you really want to embrace it, just start walking outside of your house and just find vistas for you to like draw inspiration from. Because I promise you, no matter where you walk in the world, you're gonna find some view, some perspective that just you go, oh my gosh, that looks beautiful. I wish I could capture that in some way. Um, I do that all the time. I go walk at. There's a nearby park I go walk at all the time, and every time I go, I see something that like, oh, that's just gorgeous. Like I'm so thankful I live so close to this park that I get to like enjoy this view, especially during the evening. Because during the evening, it's actually like it's kind of cool. Like the temperature is kind of cool, and it's nice to walk around. And there's a football stadium nearby to like block some of the sunlight, so it's that helps. And um, I just I enjoy it, and I look at how scenic it is, and I go, you know what? One of these days I'm gonna paint this view because it's just so nice. Um, so I think that's all I got, really. I think that's all I've got for this. I might be done with the stream unless anybody else has any like questions they want to ask or anything that they want to chime in. I'll give myself till I finish this panel, and if I don't hear anything from anybody, I think I'll call it for today. But I was really happy actually that Verb that had asked that question in the Discord. And I'll actually take this moment. I should mention, if for some reason you're not in the Mancers Union Discord and you want to, there should be a link in the description of this video. And the other thing I wanted to do, since I have the time and I keep forgetting to do this, and I want to make this a routine thing that I do for these videos, is I wanted to just thank my Patreon supporters real quick, since I remembered. So, eternal gratitude goes to Troy Morris, Paul Rainwater. Thank you very much. And then special thanks to Pharmacist Judge, Leo Empire, Dark Link, GFY, Sudi Shearwater, Danielle Rainwater, Matt Walters, John Durrett. Thank y'all so much for your support through my Patreon, and always appreciate it. So anyway, like I was saying, I'm going to finish this panel off, and I'll probably be super quiet because I'm kind of running out of things to talk about. That background thing was a very, I had a lot to say about it, but now I'm like done. Like there's a point where I'm just like I'm done talking. That's all the information I have. So like I said, like if y'all have any other questions in regards to either questions about art, questions about animation, creative process stuff, or even if you have like, you have a creative question you're trying to go through right now and you're trying to figure out and you need somebody to like spitball with, feel free to leave it in the comments. Even after the video, you're certainly welcome to leave it in the comments and I can get to it. I either get to it in a future stream or I can respond to what you're saying right then and there. But right now I'm just going to finish drawing Hizzard here. I feel like this has been a challenging page today because not because the page itself is actually difficult, but because I'm just like my brain's poopy today, like it often is on Mondays. You know, and this is a background where, like, here's a great way for actually for me to sort of explain how I think about designing backgrounds, right? And this is a little bit different because, you know, in comics, there's this kind of, since most artists are the only person who's doing like all the elements in the panel, there is sort of this back and forth that goes on on the interior for an artist where they sort of go over like, okay, what is it that I actually have the time to portray? Some artists go all out and they just portray every little detail, you know, in their panel, right? I have learned over time, and there are artists who do this who I really appreciate, but like I've sort of learned that there's an issue with how much detail you put into an environment. And one of those issues is the human eye only has so much capacity to like roll over like what they're looking at. So, for example, one of my favorite comics ever is called The Inkle, Incal. It's written by Alejandro Jodorowsky and illustrated by Mobius. Mobius is like one of my favorite artists ever. He's just super creative, very interesting in the sort of ideas that he comes up with, and all of his comics work have always been sort of like very unique and creative, and like there's nobody like him and everybody wants to be like him. Like everybody wants to copy him because he's one of those greats. So he's a French artist and he tends to have sort of an interesting strike between sort of realism and cartooning. And I'm sure if you asked him, he would probably describe himself as a cartoonist. I don't know, but like the way that he draws is just very organic and is very interesting, and he likes to do world building, and so there tends to be a lot more detail in his environments in his work. But if you ever look at his work, he kind of does this thing that I think is very interesting where he tries to think of the panel holistically, which is to say like sometimes he has panels where exclusively his focus is on depicting the environment, right? So like what's being drawn is just everything. He's just going all out. And then sometimes it'll be like a super massive environment that's happening in the scene, but then he'll start to compose panels where he starts to get more minimalistic on the environment because he wants the reader to focus on the action that's taking place with the characters. And this is something that I've learned is that sometimes you want to have backgrounds and sometimes you want to let the backgrounds fade out a little bit so that your audience can pay attention more to the really important stuff that's happening in the immediacy of the moment. So you know, if you're having like a chase scene, right? Let's say, I don't know, your main hero's on a motorcycle going down a cityscape, right? You might want to open that scene with a full-on illustration of that cityscape and the person on the motorcycle within it. But once that's established, you need to zero in and focus more on what is happening between your hero and the person who's chasing them, right? At that point, you want to focus less and less and less on the environment around you. So there is like, particularly with comics, and I would say this is also the case with animation or even with film too. With any kind of storytelling, there's a certain sort of like rhythm and pacing that you have to figure out, and part of that rhythm and pacing is figuring out how to not overload your audience with information, because if you give them too much, and this is the example I'm about to use is probably going to damn me because so many people love this movie, and I enjoyed it too. It's a really good movie, but it is too much, like informational wise. And that's like Into the Spider-Verse is too, like, that movie has too much information on the screen at any given point in time. And I get that's kind of the point, right, of the movie. I get that that's like, I think that was the second movie, right? I think that one's called Into the Spider-Verse. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. I like that movie a lot. It's really good. But there are numerous moments in that movie where I'm just like, how am I supposed to take in all this information? It's overload. It's actually too much. And it's actually too much of a good thing. Fortunately, like, the people who wrote the script on that movie, like, did such a good job that, I mean, it survives sort of that animation overload. And I say this in a very sincere way. That movie kind of suffers from the overload that is like put into it. Like, on a level, I'm like, I appreciate it. I appreciate like the love that went into it, but on another level, I'm just like, y'all could have pulled this back a little bit and made that movie easier for people to take in. Because ultimately, what ends up happening is just like, well, for me anyway, maybe I'm just a boomer. That's the other thing. Maybe I'm just like old, and I'm just like, kids these days with their, you know, with their overloaded cotton candy Spider-Man movies. Like, what's going on? Um, but anyway, my point is, I do believe, this is just a personal belief of mine and a personal design philosophy, that there is a delicate balance between yourself and your audience that you have to strike. And part of that delicate balance is determining like just how much information should you portray at any given point in time. And so I would say, I mean, if you compare sort of like the average amount of information in a given Webtoon panel, right, versus the average amount of information in any, like, literally any shot of Into the Spider-Verse, right? It's night and day. Like, Into the Spider-Verse is like, it's this like, every scene is like this kaleidoscopic, psychedelic trip, which maybe that's the point, and like, I appreciate that aspect of it. But if you're going to do that, then focus a little less on the storyline. That's how I feel, right? Like, if you're going to do that, don't have a storyline. Like, but instead we have this kind of elaborate storyline that we have to pay attention to, that's about like multiverses and, all these characters interacting and yada yada, and like, and once again, I appreciated the story, but there's a point where it's like, I don't think I can pay attention to this, because there's just too much stuff going on. And and so that sort of gets back to my initial point. And like hopefully they get to make, their conclusion to that storyline, because it's look, I really like the very first one. Are they just all called Into the Spider-Verse? The very first one where it's just like you meet Spider-Ham and Noir and you know, deadbeat dad Spider-Man and like, well, I guess original Peter Parker or whatever, um, and all that stuff. I like that movie a lot because it's honed in, and it's not overload. It's like just the right. It's just the right balance of like, um, really fun, extreme animation, a very unique sort of take on, the Spider-Man property. It's one of the better. It's actually like it's one of the few Marvel movies I would call good. Like most Marvel movies are not good, but that first Spider-Verse movie, really good, really really good. And like I said, Into the Spider-Verse is also pretty good. like like Spider-Verse is really good. I would even say masterpiece, And then Into the Spider-Verse I would say is pretty good. Like it's pretty good. But it's just like so much. But that is actually, I will say, another great example if you're looking for environments, like inspiration for environments, another wonderful example. Really amazing environmental work that went into that movie. Um, just, it is like, for all of my complaints, it is like a treasure trove of artistry and like just absolute, full throttle animation at its finest. So, I'm complaining, but it's a complaint out of love. I'm complaining from a place of love because I do really like what that studio is doing, and I want them to do more of it, but I do also want them to like hone it in a little bit because they're getting a little um they might be getting a little too ambitious and could actually like kind of shoot them in the foot a little bit. And especially if you're going to do a story that's like a multiverse story and there's just like a bajillion characters and there's just so much to keep up with, like you got to hone it in just a tiny 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 bit, you know. Anyway, I'm going to conclude this stream. Thanks for hanging out, y'all. Hopefully, if y'all wanted to learn things, y'all learned things. If you didn't want to learn things, I would apologize, but that would be an insult to myself and my level of knowledge in this field. So, hopefully you were either stimulated or relaxed or found some sort of solace in my rambling. So anyway, I hope y'all have a good one, and we will talk again soon. All right, bye.